Yes, it's me, Monique Josephine, and we are going to continue on our series of Hillbilly Elegy today. We're in chapter 9, which in this chapter it is a little sticky. So, this is the chapter where JD finds himself in a real conflict regarding his mother, her addiction, and what possibly his role should be in assisting her in a way that kind of goes against his values, and he feels a little bit compromised by having to support her in this way. Also, it's kind of where JD has to kick it into high gear because Mama, she isn't playing with him. She is ready to go full throttle on his schooling. She doesn't want him to slack off anymore. She really presses him to do the best that he possibly can. This is also the time when Mama insists that JD gets a job. And in that, he starts to recognize some trends in his community that play a part in discovering exactly what the underlying issues are in the hillbilly community, and just also recognizing and contrasting the hillbilly, his community, with the other communities. So let's not delay any further and get started. Chapter 9. Mama knew little of how this arrangement affected me, partly by design. During a long Christmas break, just a couple of months after I'd moved in with my new stepfather, I called her to complain. But when she answered, I could hear the voice of family in the background, my aunt, I thought, and Cousin Gail, and perhaps some others. The background noise suggested holiday merriment, and I didn't have the heart to tell her I had called her to say that I loathed living with these strangers and that everything that had made my life to that point tolerable, the reprieve of her house, the company of my sister, and had apparently vanished. I asked her to tell everyone whose voice I hear in the background that I loved them. And then I hung up the phone and marched upstairs to watch TV. I had never felt so alone. Happily, I continued to attend Middletown School, which kept me in touch with my school friends and gave me an excuse to spend a few hours at Mama's. During active school sessions, I saw her a few times a week, and every time I did, she reminded me of the importance of doing well academically. She often remarked that if anyone in our family made it, it would be me. That faith that she has in him, I know has carried him so far. Just the belief, like the fact that she believed in him, meant so much. I didn't have the heart to tell her what was really happening. I was supposed to be a lawyer or a doctor or a businessman, not a high school dropout. But I was much closer to dropping out than I was to anything else. She learned the truth when Mom came to me one morning demanding a jar of clean urine. I had stayed at Mama's the night before and was getting ready for school when Mom walked in frantic, out of breath. She had to submit a random urinalysis from the nursing school board in order to keep her license. And someone had called that morning demanding a sample by the end of the day. Mama's piss dirtied with half a dozen prescription drugs, so I was the only candidate. Mom's demand came with a strong air of entitlement. She had no remorse, no sense that she was asking me to do something that was wrong. Nor was there any guilt over the fact that she had broken yet another promise to never use drugs. I refused. Sensing my resistance, Mom transitioned. She became apologetic and desperate. She cried and begged, "I promise I'll do better. I promise." I had heard that many times before, and I didn't believe it even a little. Lindsay once told me that above all, Mom was a survivor. She survived her childhood. She survived the men who came and went. She survived successive brushes with the law. And now she was doing everything she could to survive an encounter with the nursing board. Ain't that the truth? You ain't finna bring Bev down. She is a survivor, especially when you see her today and she is just over 10 years sober, an active grandmother and a pillar in JD's life. Makes those facts make this story even that much sweeter because she she did it. She made it. Ah! That has to be such a great feeling today that he can depend on her. So, back to it. I exploded. I told Mom that if she wanted clean piss, then she should stop fucking up her life and get it from her own bladder. I told Mama that enabling Mom made it worse, and that if she had put her foot down 30 years earlier, then maybe Mom wouldn't be begging her son for clean piss. I told Mom that she was a shitty mother, and I told Mama that she was a shitty mother too. The color drained from Mama's face, and she refused to even look me in the eye. What I had said had clearly struck a nerve. Though I meant these things, I also knew that my urine might not be clean. Mom collapsed onto the couch crying quietly, but Mama wouldn't give in so easily. Even though I'd wounded her with my criticism, I pulled Mama into the bathroom and whispered a confession that I had smoked Ken's pot twice in the past few weeks. I can't give it to her. If Mom takes my pee, we could both be in trouble. First, Mama assuaged my fears. A couple of hits of pot over 3 weeks ago wouldn't show up on the screen, she told me. Besides, you probably didn't know what the hell you were doing. You didn't inhale, even if you tried. Then she addressed the morality of it. I know this isn't right, honey, but she's your mother and she's my daughter. And maybe if we help her this time, she'll finally learn her lesson. Just that hope is almost painful. Now we know today it's different, and thank the Lord, but I can just feel that endless loop of hope, let down, hope, let down, hope, let down. And it can defeat you. It was the internal hope, the thing to which I couldn't say no. It was the eternal hope, the thing to which I couldn't say no. That hope drove me to voluntarily attend those many NA meetings, consume books on addiction, and participate in Mom's treatment to the fullest extent that I could. It had driven me to get in the car with her when I was 12, knowing that her emotional state could lead her to do something she'd regret later. Mama never lost that hope. After more heartache and more disappointment than I could possibly fathom. Her life was a clinic in how to lose faith in people, but Mama always found a way to believe in the people that she loved. So I don't regret relenting. Giving Mom that piss was wrong, but I'll never regret following Mama's lead. Her hope allowed me to forgive Papa after the rough years of their marriage, and it convinced her to take me in when I needed her most. Sorry, I messed that up. Her hope allowed her to forgive Papa after the rough years of their marriage, and it convinced her to take me in when I needed her most. Though I followed Mama's lead, something inside me broke that morning. I went to school red eyed from crying and regretful that I'd helped. A few weeks earlier, I had sat with Mom at a Chinese buffet as she tried in vain to shovel food in her mouth. It's a memory that still makes my blood boil. Mom, unable to open her eyes or close her mouth, spooning food in as it fell back out on the plate. Other people stared at us. Ken was speechless, and Mom was oblivious. It was a prescription pain pill, or many of them, that had done this to her. I hated her for it, and I promised myself that if she ever did drugs again, I'd leave the house. The urine episode was the last straw for Mama. When I came home from school, Mama told me that she wanted me to stay with her permanently, with no more moving in between. Mom seemed not to care. She needed a break. She said, I sup- she said, I suppose from being a mother. She needed a break from being a mother, is what she's saying. Okay, that's logical. Not like you've had so much time off. Anyways, I'm not going to go on a rant. She and Ken didn't last much longer. No surprise there. By the end of sophomore year, she had moved out of his house and I had moved in with Mama, never to return to the homes of Mom and her men. At least she passed her piss test. I didn't even have to pack because much of what I owned remained at Mama's. As I bounced from place to place, she didn't approve of me taking too many of my belongings to Ken's house, convinced that he and his kids might steal my socks and shirts. Neither Ken nor his children ever stole from me. Though I loved living with her, my new home tested my patience on many levels. I still harbored the insecurity that I was burdening her. More important, she was a hard woman to live with, quick witted and sharp tongued. If I didn't take out the garbage, she told me to stop being a lazy piece of shit. When I forgot to do my homework, she called me a shit for brains and reminded me that unless I studied, I'd amount to nothing. You gotta love that rough kick in the behind because that's what children need, honestly. Like, can we stop tiptoeing and babying these weak children? That's harsh. Okay. I hear myself. That's harsh. Sorry. I apologize. But tell me if we don't bring these kids everywhere, make it all about them. They are rarely having to just sit there with their imaginations, entertaining themselves. We have them glued to a screen. And not to say much about ourselves, I mean, that's what everybody is doing. We're not setting good examples. But I do think many kids could benefit from a swift kick in the behind and some frank talking to. Okay, she demanded that I played card games with her, usually gin rummy, and she never lost. You're the worst fucking card player I've ever met, she'd gloat. That one didn't make me feel bad. She said it to everyone she beat, and she beat everyone at gin rummy. God, that's so cute. Years later, every single one of my relatives, Aunt Wee, Uncle Jimmy, even Lindsay, repeated some version of, Mama was really hard on you. Too hard. There were three rules in her house: get good grades, get a job, and get off your ass and help me. Those might as well be the golden rules, okay? Children, Get good grades, get a job, and get off your ass and help me. I love that. Someone put that in a frame. There was no set chore list. I just had to help her with whatever she was doing. And she never told me what to do. She just yelled at me if she did anything and I wasn't helping. You gotta love that. There's like no structure, no definition of what you are responsible for. It's like you're responsible for noticing if I'm the only one working and to come on over. But we had a lot of fun. Mama had a much bigger bark than a bite, at least with me. Once she ordered me to watch a TV show with her on Friday night, a creepy murder mystery. The type of show Mama loved to watch at the climax of the show during a moment designed to make the viewer jump. Mama flipped off the lights and screamed in my ear. She'd seen this episode before and knew what was coming. She made me sit there for 45 minutes just so she could scare me at the appointed time. That's so sweet. I love this relationship so much and I can't I can't even contain it. It's the sweetest, most wholesome, like from poverty, best love you can get. The best part about living with Mama was that I began to understand what made her tick. Until then, I had rescinded how rarely we traveled to Kentucky. After Mama's after Mama Blanton's death, the decline in visit wasn't noticeable at first, but by the time I started middle school, we visited Kentucky only a few times a year for a few days at a time. Living with Mama, I learned that she and her sister Rose, a woman of uncommon kindness, had a falling out after their mother died. Mama had hoped that the old house would become a sort of family timeshare, while Rose had hoped that the house would go to her son and his family. Rose had a point. None of the siblings who lived in Ohio or Indiana visited often enough, so it made sense to give the house to someone who would use it. But Mama feared that without a home base, her children and grandchildren would have no place to stay during their visits to Jackson. She too had a point. I started to understand that Mama saw returning to Jackson as a duty to endure rather than a source of enjoyment. To me, Jackson was about my uncles and chasing turtles and finding peace from the instability that plagued my Ohio existence. Jackson gave me a shared home with Mama, a 3-hour road trip to tell and listen to stories, and a place where everyone knew me as the grandson of the famous Jim and Bonnie Vance. Jackson, sorry, I can't help that I do that. A place where everyone knew me as the grandson of the famous Jim and Bonnie Vance. Jackson was something much different to her. It was the place where she sometimes went hungry as a child, from which she ran in the wake of a teenage pregnancy scandal, and where so many of her friends had given their lives in the mines. I wanted to escape to Jackson, and she had escaped from it. In her old age, with limited mobility, Mama loved to watch TV. She preferred raunchy humor and epic dramas, so she had a lot of opinions. But her favorite show by far was the HBO mob story of The Sopranos. Looking back, it's hardly surprising that a show about a fiercely loyal, sometimes violent outsiders resonated with Mama. Changed the names, dates, the Italian mafia stars to look a lot like the Hillbilly McCoy dispute back in Appalachia. The show's main character, Tony Soprano, was a violent killer, an objectively terrible person by almost any standard. But Mama respected his loyalty, and the fact that he would go to any length to protect the honor of his family, though he murdered countless enemies and drank excessively. The only criticism she ever levied against him involves his infidelity. He always slept around. I don't like that. Also, for the first time, Mama's love of children, not as an object of her affection, but as an observer of it. She often babysat for Lindsay or Aunt Wee's young kids. One day, she had both of Aunt Wee's girls for the day and Aunt Wee's dog in the backyard. When the dog barked, Mama screamed, "Shut up, you son of a bee!" My cousin Bonnie Rose ran to the backyard and began screaming over and over, "Son of a bitch, son of a bitch." Mama hobbled over to Bonnie Rose and scooped her into her arms. "Shh, you can't say that or you'll get me in trouble." But she was laughing so hard that she could barely get the words out. A few weeks later, I got home from school and asked Mama how her day had gone. She told me she'd had a great day because she'd been watching Lindsay's son, Cameron. He asked me if I could say, like I do. I told him yes, but only at my house. Then she chuckled quietly to herself. Regardless of how she felt, whether her emphysema made it difficult to breathe or her hip hurt so badly that she could barely walk, she never turned down an opportunity to spend time with those babies. As she put it, Mama loved them. Oh, to spend time with those babies, as she put it. Mama loved them, and I began to understand why she had always dreamed of becoming a lawyer for abused and neglected children. So this is something, this sense of the special care that you take of kids, I think it is a special attribute from people who have been mistreated or, you know, we all missed something in our childhood, and that's what you take special care of in kids that you're caring for as an adult. And I remember, I don't have any kids, but I'm the youngest of six, and all of my siblings have kids who, any time of day of the week, they could take to my dad's house and leave for any duration of time. And I just remember the joke was like, if one of my sisters came to my dad's without their kids, he'd be like, there's no use in coming if you don't bring the kids. Like, why waste your time and mine? Because I need to see those babies. And I didn't realize it until I got my first job as an adult in like the corporate world that people's parents and families didn't do that across the board. Like one of my first friends I made at the company I work for, I remember her talking about not having help with her kids. And I'm like, oh, that's so sad. I just assumed her family lived far away in another state. And no, her mom lived in the same neighborhood. And the fact that she just couldn't drop her kids off at her mom's house at any given moment just shocked me to the core. And it was so outside of what I knew because, we may have grown up with nothing tangible or without all of the bells and whistles of necessities. Like, we did have family, we did have love, and it has endured. And it's the strongest thing that runs through my family is that loyalty and love. And we look out for our kids. Like one of my brothers has abandoned two of his sons, which we are all just like, oh my gosh, you know, the shame my dad would have if he was living. But my sister has literally stepped in as a co-parent to those boys because the responsibility that we feel to these kids of our bloodline that represent my dad, and we know what he would do if he were living. So yeah, anywho, back to at some point, Mama underwent major back surgery to help with the pain that made walking so difficult. She landed in a nursing home for a few months to recover, forcing me to live alone, an experience that happily didn't last long. Every night she called Lindsay, Aunt Wee, or me and made the same request. I hate the damn food here. Can you go to Taco Bell and get me a bean burrito? See, Mama knows her stuff because that's my top pick at Taco Bell. Indeed, Mama hated everything about the nursing home and once asked me to promise that if she ever faced a permanent stay, I'd take her 44 Magnum and put a bullet in her head. Gosh, this, it hits so close. Mama, you can't ask me to do that. I'd go to the jail for the rest of my life. Well, she said, pausing for a moment to reflect, then get your hands on some arsenic. That way, no one will know. Her back surgery, it turned out, was completely unnecessary. She had a broken hip, and as soon as the surgeon repaired it, she was back on her feet, though she used a walker or a cane from then on. Now that I am a lawyer, I marvel that we never considered a medical malpractice suit against the doctor who operated unnecessarily on her back. Can you imagine your senior grandmother going through an unnecessary back surgery that major that puts her in a nursing home for months when all along she had a broken hip? Yeah, that's malpractice and incredible. Okay, but Mama wouldn't have allowed it. She didn't believe in using the legal system until you had to. Sometimes I'd see Mom every few days, and sometimes I'd go a couple of weeks without hearing from her at all. After one breakup, she spent a few months on Mama's couch, and we both enjoyed her company. Mom tried in her own way. When she was working, she'd always give me money on paydays, almost certainly more than she could afford. For reasons I never quite understood, Mom equated money with affection. Perhaps she felt that I would never appreciate that she loved me unless she offered me a wad of spending money. But I never cared about the money. I just wanted her to be healthy. Not even my closest friends knew that I lived with my grandma. I recognized that though many of my peers lacked the traditional American family, mine was more non traditional than most. And we were poor, a status Mama wore like a badge of honor, but one I'd hardly come to grips with. I didn't wear clothes from Abercrombie and Fitch or American Eagle unless I'd received them for Christmas. When Mama picked me up from school, I'd ask her not to get out of the car lest my friends see her, wearing her uniform of baggy jeans, a men's t shirt with a giant menthol cigarette hanging from her lip. When people asked, I lied and told them that I lived with my mom, that she and I took care of my ailing grandmother. Even today, I regret that far too many high school friends and acquaintances never knew Mama was the best thing that ever happened to me. My junior year, I tested into the honors advanced math class, a hybrid of trigonometry, advanced algebra, and pre-calculus. Okay, JD, we see you. The class instructor, Ron Shelby, enjoyed the legendary status among the students for his brilliance and high demands. In 20 years, he had never missed a day of school, according to the Middleton High School legend. A student called in a bomb threat during one of Shelby's exams, hiding the explosive device in a bag in his locker. With the entire school evacuated outside, Shelby marched into the school, retrieved the contents of the kid's locker, marched outside, and threw those contents into the trash can. I've had that kid in class. He's not smart enough to make a functioning bomb, Shelby told police officers gathered at the school. Now let my students go back to class to finish their exams. Mama loved stories like this. And though she'd never met Shelby, she admired him and encouraged me to follow his lead. His name is Selby, not Shelby, sorry. Selby encouraged, but didn't require, his students to obtain advanced graphing calculators. The Texas Instrument Model 89 was the latest and greatest. We didn't have cell phones and we didn't have nice clothes, but Mama made sure I had one of those graphic calculators. This taught me an important lesson about Mama's values, and it forced me to engage with school in a way I never had before. If Mama could drop $180 on a graphing calculator, she insisted that I spend none of my own money. Then I had better take schoolwork more seriously. I owed it to her, and she reminded me of it constantly. Have you finished your work for that Selby teacher? No, Mama, not yet. You damned well better start. I didn't spend every penny I had on that little computer so you could go F around all day. So in the movie of Hillbilly Elegy, it actually shows that he goes to like a Radio Shack type place and steals a Texas Instrument calculator. And, Mama is so disappointed, and I think also mortified at the fact that he's stealing something that he actually, they say they didn't require it, but I remember, and you did really need it for school. But yeah, I feel like she didn't let JD off the hook for stealing it, made him return it and tell the store clerk that he had stolen it, and then she proceeded to buy it. And this is when he and his mama are splitting her Meals on Wheels Social Security food because she can't afford to, you know, feed a growing teenager and herself off of the little income that she's getting, her fixed income from the state. So it's just, it just shows. And it also kind of cements the fact that during those times and during that sacrifice, those are the best times, when you don't have everything you need, when you are grinding away at it. They always say it's not the journey. No, it's not the destination, it's the journey. And as cheesy and cringy as that is, when we look back, it's so true. It's so true. You don't need anything to be happy physically or monetarily, as long as your, main requirements of life are being met. If you're surrounded by people that love you, and that's kind of what that drills into me. And I'm sorry, I'm off topic a little bit because I'm not sorry, but let me just make clear that do have a wandering mind. Let me get back to it. I didn't spend every penny I had on that little computer so you could go F around all day. JD. Those 3 years with Mama, uninterrupted and alone, saved me. I didn't notice the causality of the change, how living with her turned my life around. I didn't notice that my grades began to improve immediately after I moved in. And I couldn't have known that I was making lifelong friends. During that time, Mama and I started to talk about the problems in our community. Mama encouraged me to get a job. She told me that it would be good for me and that I needed to learn the value of a dollar. When her encouragement fell on deaf ears, she then demanded that I get a job. So I did, as a cashier at Dillman's, a local grocery store. That's kind of what RFK Jr., I like something that he says about his dad coming back from the Delta in the South, like Mississippi area. And when RFK Sr. was still like a growing boy in a home with his family, his dad had come home and told the family about the trip that he had just had down in the Delta. And this was an area of very, very poverty stricken people that were actually, it was like the small percentage of Americans that were actually dying of malnutrition, starvation, and whatever those parasites are that you get from drinking dirty water. And he had come home and said that to RFK Sr., um, actually to RFK Sr. and all of his siblings, including JFK, all of them. And he said, when you guys grow up, I want you to help those people of the Delta. Those are your people. These politicians with pockets lined with money, those aren't your people. They already have advocates for them. It's those people in the Delta. Those are the Kennedy people. Those are your people. And when you grow up, I want you to spend your life serving those people. And it always touched me because you can tell how it affected RFK that his dad gave that order to go to these poorer classes where they really need you, where it's going to be harder, where it isn't luxurious. And the way that RFK Jr. tells that story, you can feel it. You can feel the emotion and the sincerity and the seriousness of that order from Joe Kennedy. And to think that it's come down from two generations, this order that he gave one night at dinner, and that they took it to heart and actually went out and fought for the poor, fought for the people who couldn't fight for themselves, and never feared away from the big company machine that puts profit over everything. That's kind of what it reminds me of when he starts talking about the problems in their community and the fact that he's able to escape that and will go back and help. Working as a cashier turned me into an amateur sociologist. A frenetic stress animated so many of our customers. One of our neighbors would walk in and yell at me for the smallest of transgressions. Not smiling at her, not bagging the groceries too heavy one day or too light the next. Oh my gosh, yeah, that's how my dad was. That generation would be so particular about bagging groceries, How much weight? Is it doubled? All the dairy in one, all the meat in one, all the yeah, frozen stuff in one. Some came into the store in a hurry, pacing between aisles, looking frantically for a particular item. But others waded through the aisles deliberately, carefully, marking each item off their list. Some folks purchased a lot of canned foods, frozen food, while others consistently arrived at the checkout counter with carts piled high with fresh produce. The more hurried a customer, the more they purchased pre cooked or frozen food, the more likely they were to be poor. And I knew they were poor because of the clothes they wore or because they purchased their food with food stamps. After a few months, I came home and asked Mama why only poor people bought baby formula. Dang, this is interesting. Don't rich people have babies too? Mama had no answer, and it would be many years before I learned that rich folks are considerably more likely to breastfeed their children. As my job taught me a little more about America's class divide, it also imbued me with a bit of resentment directed towards both the wealthy and my own kind. The owners of Dillman were old fashioned, so they allowed people with good credit to run grocery tabs, some of which surpassed $1,000. I knew that if any of my relatives walked in and ran up a bill of over $1,000, they'd be asked to pay immediately. I hated the feeling that my boss counted my people as less trustworthy than those who took their groceries home in a Cadillac. But I got over it. One day I told myself I'll have my own damn tab. I also learned how people gamed the welfare system. They'd buy 2 dozen packs of soda with food stamps and then sell them at a discount for cash. They'd ring up their orders separately, buying food with their food stamps and beer and wine and cigarettes with cash. They'd regularly go through the checkout line, speaking on their cell phones. I could never understand why our lives felt like a struggle while those living off of the government enjoyed trinkets that I had only dreamed about. Mama listened intensely to my experience at Dillman's. We began to view much of our fellow working class with mistrust. Most of us were struggling to get by, but we made do, worked hard, and hoped for a better life. But a large minority was content to live off the dole. Every 2 weeks, I'd get a small paycheck and notice the line where federal and state income taxes were deducted from my wages. At least as often as our drug addict neighbors would buy T-bone steaks, which I was too poor to buy for myself, but I was forced by Uncle Sam to buy from someone else. Again, this is a very valid topic still today from when this book was probably written in 2015 or 16. This was my mindset when I was 17. And though I'm far less angry today than I was then, it was my first indication that the policies of Mama's party, of the working man, the Democrats, weren't all they were cracked up to be. Political scientists have spent millions of words trying to explain how the Appalachia and the South went from staunchly Democrat to staunchly Republican in less than a generation. Some blame race relations and the Democratic Party's embrace of the civil rights movement. Others cite religious faith and the hold that social conservatism have on evangelicals in that region. A big part of the explanation lies in the fact that many in the white working class saw precisely what I did working at Dillman's. As far back as the 1970s, the white working class, sorry, as far back as the 1970s, the white working class began to turn to Richard Nixon because of the perception that, as one man put it, government was paying people who are on welfare today doing nothing. They're laughing at our society, and we're all hardworking people, and we're getting laughed at for working every day. At around that time, our neighbor, one of Mama and Papa's oldest friends, registered the house next to us for Section 8. Section 8 is a government program that offers low-income residents a voucher to rent housing. Mama's friend had little luck renting his property, but when he qualified his house for Section 8, he virtually assured that would change. I am so sorry, that's so choppy, and I am getting better at reading. I hear it already. I'm getting better, but let me try that one again. Mama's friend had little luck renting his property, but when he qualified his house for the Section 8 voucher, he virtually assured that would change. Mama saw it as a betrayal, ensuring that bad people would move into the neighborhood and drive down property values. Despite our efforts to draw bright lines between the working and non-working poor, Mama and I recognized that we shared a lot in common with those whom we thought gave our people a bad name. Those Section 8 recipients looked a lot like us. The matriarch of the first family to move in next door was born in Kentucky, but moved north at a young age as her parents sought a better life. She'd gotten involved with a couple of men, each of whom had left her with a child, but no support. She was nice, and so were her kids, but the drugs and the late night fighting revealed troubles that too many hillbilly transplants knew well. Confronted with such a realization of her own family's struggle, Mama grew frustrated and angry. From that anger sprang Bonnie Vance, the social policy expert. She's a lazy whore, but she wouldn't be if she was forced to get a job. I hate those efforts for giving these people the money to move into our neighborhood. She'd rant against the people we'd see in the grocery store. I can't understand why people who've worked all their lives to scrape by while these deadbeats buy liquor and cell phone coverage with our tax money. Preach. I say preach, that's all jokes, okay? Because I grew up on food stamps and welfare, so let's not get ahead of ourselves. These were bizarre views from my bleeding heart. These were bizarre views from my bleeding heart grandma. And if she blasted the government for doing too much one day, she'd blast it for doing too little the next. The government, after all, was just helping poor people find a place to live, and my grandma loved the idea of anyone helping the poor. She had no philosophical objection to Section 8 vouchers. So the Democrat in her would resurface. She'd rant about the lack of jobs and wonder aloud whether that was why our neighbors couldn't find a good man. In her more compassionate moments, Mama asked if it made any sense that our society could afford aircraft carriers, but not but not drug treatment facilities, like moms, for everyone. Sometimes she'd criticize the faceless rich whom she saw as far too unwilling to carry their fair share of the social burden. Mama saw every ballot failure of the local school improvement tax, and there were many, as an indictment of our society's failure to provide a quality education to kids like me. Whoopsie. Mama's sentiments occupied widely different parts of the political spectrum, depending on her mood. Mama was a radical conservative or a European style Democrat. Because of this, I initially assumed that Mama was an unreformed simpleton, and that as soon as she opened her mouth about policy or politics, I might as well close my ears. Yet I quickly realized that in Mama's contradictions lay great wisdom. I had spent so many long just surviving, I had spent so long just surviving my world. But now that I had a little space to observe it, I began to see the world as Mama did. I was scared, confused, angry, and heartbroken. I'd blame large businesses for closing up shop and moving overseas. And then I'd blame and then I'd wonder if I might have done the same thing. I'd curse our government for not helping enough. And then I'd wonder if, in its attempts to help, it actually made the problems worse. Mama could spew venom like a Marine Corps drill instructor, but what she saw in our community didn't just piss her off, it broke her heart. Behind the drugs and the fighting matches and the financial struggles, these were people with serious problems and they were hurting. Our neighbors had a kind of desperate sadness in their lives. You'd see it in how the mother would grin but never really smile, or in the jokes that the teenage girl told about her mother smacking the shit out of her. I knew what awkward humor like this was meant to conceal because I'd used it in the past. Grin and bear it, says the adage. If anyone appreciated this, Mama did. The problems of our community hit close to home. Mom struggles weren't some isolated incident. They were replicated, replayed, and relived by many of the people who, like us, had moved hundreds of miles in search of a better life. There was no end in sight, and Mama had thought she escaped the poverty of the hills, but the poverty, emotional, if not financial, had followed her. Something had made her later years eerily similar to her earliest ones. What was happening? What were our neighbor's teenage daughter's prospects? Certainly, the odds were against her. With a home life like that, this raised questions. What would happen to me? I was unable to answer these questions in a way that didn't implicate something deep within the place I called home. What I knew is that other people didn't live like we did. We visited Uncle Jimmy. I did not wake to the scream of neighbors. In Aunt Wee and Dan's neighborhood, homes were beautiful and lawns were well manicured, and the police came around to smile and wave, but never to load someone's mom or dad in the back of their cruiser. So I wondered what was different about us. Not just me and my family, but our neighborhood and our town and everyone from Jackson to Middleton and beyond. When mom was arrested a couple years earlier, the neighborhood's porches and front yards filled with spectators. There's no embarrassment like waving the neighbors right after the cops have carted your mother off. Mom's exploits were undoubtedly extreme, but all of us had seen the show before with different neighbors. These sorts of things had their own rhythm. A mild screaming match might invite a few cracked shutters or peeking eyes behind the shades. If things escalated a bit, bedrooms would illuminate as people awoke to investigate the commotion. And if things got out of hand, the police would come and take someone's drunk dad or unhinged mom down to the city building. That building housed the tax collector, the public utilities, and even a small museum. But all the kids in my neighborhood knew it as the home of Middleton's short term jail. I consumed a book about social policy and the working poor. One book in particular, a study by eminent sociologist William Julius Wilson called The Truly Disadvantaged, struck a nerve. I was 16 the first time I read it, and though I didn't fully understand it all, I grasped the core thesis. As millions migrated north to factory jobs, the communities that sprouted up around those factories were vibrant but fragile. When those factories shut their doors, the people left behind were trapped in towns and cities that could no longer support such large populations with high quality work. Those who could general those who could generally the well educated, wealthy, or well connected left, leaving behind communities of poor people. These remaining folks were the truly disadvantaged, unable to find good jobs on their own, and surrounded by communities that offered little in the way of connection or social support. Wilson's book spoke to me. I wanted to write him a letter and tell him that he had described my home perfectly, that it resonated so personally, it's odd. However, because he wasn't writing about the hillbilly transplants from Appalachia, he was writing about Black people in the inner cities. The same was true of Charles Murray's seminal Losing Ground, another book about Black folks that could have been written about hillbillies, which addressed the ways our government encouraged social decay through the welfare state. Though insightful, neither of these books fully answered the questions that plagued me. Why didn't our neighbors leave that abusive man? Why did she spend her money on drugs? Why couldn't she see that her behavior was destroying her daughter? Why were all of these things happening not just to our neighbor, but to my mom? It would be years before I learned that no single book or expert or field could fully explain the problem of hillbillies in modern America. Our elegy is a sociological one, yes, but it's also a psychological and community and culture and faith. During my junior year of high school, our neighbor Patty called her landlord to report a leaky roof. The landlord arrived and found Patty topless, stoned, and unconscious on her living room couch. Upstairs, the bathtub was overflowing, hence the leaking roof. Patty had apparently drawn herself a bath, taken a few prescription painkillers, and passed out. The top floor of her home and many of her family's possessions were ruined. This is the reality of our community. It's about a naked druggie destroying what little of value exists in her life. It's about children who lose their toys and clothes to a mother's addiction. Another neighbor lived alone in a big pink house. She was a recluse, a neighborhood mystery. She came outside only to smoke. She never said hello, and her lights were always off. She and her husband had divorced, and her children had landed in jail. She was extremely obese. As a child, I used to wonder if she hated the outdoors because she was too heavy to move. There were neighbors down the street, a younger woman with a toddler and her middle-aged boyfriend. The boyfriend worked, and the woman spent her days watching The Young and the Restless. Her young son was adorable. He loved Mama. At all times of the day, one time past midnight, he would wander to her doorstep and ask for a snack. His mother had all the time in the world, but she couldn't keep a close eye to watch her child to prevent him from straying into the homes of strangers. Sometimes his diapers would need changing. Mama once called social services on the woman, hoping they'd somehow rescue the young boy. They did nothing. So Mama used my nephew's diapers and kept a watchful eye on the neighborhood, always looking for signs of her little buddy. My sister's friend lived in a small duplex with her mother, a welfare queen, if one ever existed. She had 7 siblings, most of them from the same father, which was unfortunately a rarity. Her mother had never held a job and seemed interested only in breeding, as Mama put it. Her kids never had a chance. One ended up in an abusive relationship that produced a child before the mom was old enough to purchase cigarettes. The oldest overdosed on drugs and was arrested not long after he graduated from high school. This was my world, a world of truly irrational behavior. We spend our way into the poorhouse. We buy giant TVs and iPads. Our children wear nice clothes thanks to the high interest credit cards and payday loans. We purchased homes we don't need and refinance them for more spending money and declare bankruptcy, often leaving them full of garbage in our wake. Thrift is in, in inimical in our being. I don't know that word. Sorry, I can't spell it. We spend to pretend that we're upper class, and when the dust clears, when bankruptcy hits, or a family member bails out of our stupidity, there's nothing left over. Nothing for the kids, college tuition, no investments to grow our wealth, no rainy day fund if someone loses their job. We know we shouldn't spend like this. Sometimes we beat ourselves up over it, but we do it anyway. Our homes are a chaotic mess. We scream and yell at each other like we're spectators at a football game. At least one member of the family uses drugs. Sometimes the father, sometimes the mother, sometimes both. At especially stressful times, we'll hit and punch each other, all in front of the rest of the family, including young children. Much of the time, neighbors hear what's happening. A bad day is when a neighbor calls the police to stop the drama. Our kids go to foster care but never stay for long. We apologize to our kids. The kids believe we're really sorry, and we are, but then we act just as mean a few days later. We don't study as children, and we don't make our kids study when we're parents. Our kids perform poorly in school. We might get angry with them, but we never give them the tools like peace and quiet at home to succeed. Even the best and brightest will likely go to college close to home if they survive the war zone in their own home. I don't care if you got into Notre Dame, we say. You can't get a fine, you can get a fine, cheap education at the community college. The irony is that for poor people like us, an education at Notre Dame is both cheaper and finer. We chose not to work when we should be looking for jobs. Sometimes we'll get a job, but it won't last. We'll get fired for tardiness or for stealing merchandise and selling it on eBay, or having a customer complain about the smell of alcohol on our breath, or for taking 35-minute restroom breaks per shift. We talk about the value of hard work, but tell ourselves the reasons we're not working is some perceived unfairness. Obama shut down the coal mines, or all the jobs went to the Chinese. These are the lies we tell ourselves to solve the cognitive dissonance, the broken connection between the world we see and the values we preach. We talk to our children about responsibility, but we never walk the walk. It's like this. For years, I dreamed of owning a German Shepherd puppy. Somehow, mom found me one. But he was our fourth dog, and I had no clue how to train him. Within a few years, all of them had vanished, given to the police department or to a family friend. After saying goodbye to the fourth dog, our hearts hardened. We learned not to grow too attached. Our eating and exercise habits seemed designed to send us to an early grave, and it's working. In certain parts of Kentucky, local life expectancy is 67, a full decade and a half below what is in nearby Virginia. A recent study found that the unique among all ethnic groups in the United States, the life expectancy of working class white folks is going down. We eat Pillsbury cinnamon rolls for breakfast, Taco Bell for lunch, and McDonald's for dinner. We rarely cook, even though it's cheaper and better for the body and soul. Exercise is confined to the games we play as children. We see people jog on the streets only if we leave our homes for the military or for college in some distant place. Not all white working class struggles. Not all of the white working class struggle. I knew even as a child that there were two separate sets of mores and social pressures. My grandparents embodied one type, old-fashioned, quietly faithful, self-reliant, hardworking. My mother, increasingly the entire neighborhood, embodied another, consumerist, isolated, angry, distrustful. Dang, that sounds like all of us today. Consumerist, isolated, angry, and distrustful. I mean, I guess the angry part, people are surely angry, but I don't see much of that. Good. I grew another chin, sorry. There were and remain many who live by my grandparents' code. Sometimes you saw it in the subtlest ways. The old neighbor who diligently tended her garden even as her neighbors let their homes rot from the inside out. The young woman who grew up with my mom, who returned to the neighborhood every day to help her mother navigate old age. I say this not to romanticize my grandparents' way of life, which, as I've observed, was rife with problems. But I know that many in our community may have struggled, but did so successfully. These are many intact families many dinners shared in peaceful home, many children and studying hard and believing they'll claim their own American dream. Many of my friends have built successful lives and happy families in Middleton or nearby. They are not the problem. And if you believe the statistics, the children of those intact homes have plenty of reason for optimism. I always straddled those two words. Thanks to Mama, I never saw only the worst of what our community offered, and I believe that saved me. There was always a safe place and a loving embrace if I ever needed it. Our neighbors' kids couldn't say the same. On Sunday, Mama agreed to watch Aunt Wee's kids for several hours. Aunt Wee dropped them off at 10. I had to work the dreaded 11 a.m. to 8 p.m. shift at the grocery store. I hung out with the kids for about 45 minutes, then left at 10:45 for work. I was usually upset, devastated even, to leave them. I wanted nothing more than to spend the day with Mama and the babies. I told Mama that and insisted of t- I told Mama that and instead of telling me to quit your damn whining like I expected, she told me she wished that I could stay home too. It was a rare moment of empathy. But if you want the sort of work where you can spend the weekends with your family, you've got to go to college and make something of yourself. That was the essence of Mama's genius. She didn't just preach and cuss and demand. She showed me what was possible. A peaceful Sunday afternoon with the people I loved and made sure I knew how to get there. Reams of social science attest to the positive effect of a loving and stable home. I could cite dozens, I could cite a dozen studies suggesting that Mama's home offered me not just a short-term haven, but also a hope for a better life. Entire volumes are devoted to the phenomenon of resilient children, kids who prosper despite an unstable home because they have the social support of a loving adult. That's a highlight right there. Kids who prosper despite an unstable home because they have the social support of a loving adult. I know Mama was good for me, not just because some Harvard psychologist says so, but because I felt it. Consider my life before I moved in with Mama. In the middle of third grade, we left Middleton and my grandparents to live in Preble County with Bob. At the end of fourth grade, we left Preble County to live in a Middleton duplex on the 200 block of McKinley Street. At the end of fifth grade, we left the 200 block of McKinley Street to move to the 300 block of McKinley Street. And by that time, Chip was a regular in our home. Though he never lived with us, at the end of sixth grade, we remained on the 300 block of McKinley Street, but Chip had been replaced by Steve, and there were many discussions about moving in with Steve. Mom was prepared to move in with Matt, and Mom hoped that I would join her in Dayton. At the end of eighth grade, she demanded that I move to Dayton, and after a brief detour at my dad's house, I acquiesced. At the end of ninth grade, I moved in with Ken, a complete stranger, and his three kids. On top of all that were the drugs and domestic violence cases, children's service prying into our lives, and Papa dying. Today, even remembering that period long enough to write it down evokes an intense, indescribable anxiety in me. Not long ago, I noticed that a Facebook friend, an acquaintance from high school with similarly deep hillbilly roots, was constantly changing boyfriends, going in and out of relationships, posting pictures of one guy one week and another 3 weeks later, fighting on social media with her new fling until the relationship publicly, excuse me, sorry, publicly, sorry, fighting with her new fling until the relationship publicly imploded. I'm so sorry. I'm getting tired, but I just have one more page left, so I'm pushing through. I apologize for the yawn. So, posting pictures of one guy one week and another 3 weeks later, fighting on social media with her new fling until the relationship publicly imploded. She was my age with 4 children, and when she posted that she had finally found a man who would treat her well, a refrain I'd seen many times before, her 13-year-old daughter commented, "Just stop. I just want you to, I just want you and this to stop." I wish I could hug that little girl because I know how she feels. For 7 long years, I just wanted it to stop. I didn't care so much about the fighting, the screaming, or even the drugs. I just wanted a home, and I wanted to stay there. And I wanted these god danged strangers to stay the F out. Now consider the sum of my life after I moved in with Mama permanently. At the end of 10th grade, sorry, at the end of 10th grade, I lived with Mama in her house with no one else. At the end of 11th grade, I lived with Mama in her house with no one else. At the end of 12th grade, I lived with Mama in her house with no one else. I could say that the peace of Mama's home gave me a safe space to do my homework. I could say that the absence of fighting and instability let me focus on school and my job. I could say that spending all of my time in the same house with the same person made it easy for me to form lasting friendships. Lasting friendships with people at school. I could say that having a job and learning a bit about the world helped clarify precisely what I wanted out of my own life. In hindsight, those explanations make sense, and I'm certain that a bit of truth lies in each. I'm sure that sociologists and psychologists sitting in a room together could explain why I lost interest in drugs, why my grades improved, why I aced the the SATs, and why I found a couple of teachers who inspired me to love learning. But what I remember most of all is that I was happy. I no longer feared the school bell at the end of the day. I knew where I'd be living the next month, and no one's romantic decisions affected my life. And out of that happiness came so many of the opportunities I've had for the past 12 years. And there we have it. That concludes chapter 9. That was a long one, but an important one. I feel like he goes into a lot of the contrast of the difference between his life at his mom's, the instability, and those essential necessities for a developing child, what they need to be successful in school, to, like the way that he mentioned, create and sustain lasting friendships. Moving like that always being the new kid, always having to, work your way into different friend groups is incredibly hard on kids. And then just being peeled away from an environment that you've been, working so hard to fit into and then slapping you into a new place. I would say that's one of the hardest things on kids. It makes you likable and you're comfortable in places where you don't know anybody, but it's harder for you to keep long term friendships. And I know that from experience. I went to 9 different schools, and most were in elementary, a couple of middle schools, but it was hard. It was really hard. And I always wished I had just been one of those people who went to the same school from kindergarten to graduation and was in the same class with the same girls that I had sleepovers with. And, along those lines, those kind of things were so foreign. And I just longed to have some of that stability. So I can relate to that a lot. And I do understand the difference it makes to have a comfortable home with the same people. It almost initially is uncomfortable because it's a setting you're not used to. When the chaos is gone, it's awkward and uncomfortable, and you're like, something's about to pop off, and it doesn't, and you're like, it's like an uneasy feeling until you can reacquaint yourself with what normal is. So yeah, this is just such an important read, and I could read it a million times just because of how special this book is to me and how closely it relates. I know that I spend a lot of time talking about myself, and I'm sorry about that. That isn't why I wanted to start this channel, is to talk about myself. But it's just an important story that I love. And I also know that in the beginning of my channel, most of these episodes are not going to be my highest watched. So I'm just getting comfortable and confident in front of the camera. I also wanted to show you, I got this book, Hollywood Babylon. Candace Owens mentioned it. And when I looked it up and realized that it wasn't available on Audible or Amazon, I was like, oh, this is a digger. Like, if it's unapproved and exiled from the ordinary reading spaces, it's got to be good. And it's kind of, I guess, you can take a glance, it's kind of like the foundation or blueprint of some of the blackmail and darkness of Hollywood. I haven't read any of it, but I am excited to have a copy now and to see it. You can kind of tell by the black and whites that there's so many pictures. And if I'm anything, it's a sucker for a picture book. All right, you guys, thank you so much for spending your time with me. I know that time is the most valuable thing that we have, and you choosing to spend that time with me means so much to me. I hope that you enjoyed this, and take care of yourself. Ciao.